What is an MS relapse?
When you think about the pathology, what goes on in your nervous system, in the brain or spinal cord, a relapse really is a brand new lesion that forms in a particular pathway that causes symptoms. The classic example is if you get a new lesion in the optic nerve, you'll get blurring of vision. But a relapse could also be an old lesion that gets bigger, it reactivates. So it's not only about new symptoms, it could be worsening of existing symptoms. Every time a lesion hits a pathway, in that lesion, there will be damage left behind, which means that pathway, when it gets another lesion, it's got less reserve. So in other words, every time you get an attack, a new lesion, you acquire damage, and eventually you lose the ability to recover function.
I think it's very clear to most patients that if they wake up and they're having sudden trouble walking or having double vision or they can't see, that needs to be reported. But is it equally as important to report a little bit of numbness?
Yes, because it's not about the severity as such. It's about the fact that your MS is active. So even if it's a minor sensory attack, it's still an important metric. It means my MS is active.
The point is, even if you think you can manage a little bit of numbness, you need to report it. I know from experience that the treatment for relapses is high-dose steroids. And one of the pros is that they can shut down a relapse with stunning efficiency. What are some of the cons?
Well, I don't know if that shuts it down with stunning efficiency. So, because when you do actual studies, the impact of high-dose steroids is pretty marginal on average. And I agree, sometimes you have these big spinal cord relapses where people are, bedbound, and they recover very quickly. So what it does is it speeds up the recovery of an attack. It doesn't actually make any difference in the long term. And there's been lots of studies showing relapses treated with placebo, dummy drug versus steroids. The final outcome is the same at 6 months. So in terms of the long-term outcome, it does very little. The one thing about steroids, high-dose steroids, it affects mood. It can cause depression, but it can also buzz you, make you, like we call it hypomania. It can make you very active and full of energy. That's potentially a downside. We've had a few people in our center that have actually developed steroid-induced psychosis from treatment of relapses, and they have to be sectioned and develop a major psychiatric label in there. So that's one of the downsides, is the psychiatric manifestations. Less commonly is the severe depression that occurs. It causes insomnia, puts your blood sugars up, it can cause diabetes, it puts your blood pressure up. The one that I always worry the most about, because it's much commoner than reported, people think it's a very rare, but it's not that rare, is it causes, it changes the metabolism of bone marrow, and it causes this condition called avascular necrosis. So you get increased pressure in the bone and it blocks the arteries off. In the current COVID-19 crisis, it's quite clear now that if people have high-dose steroids for relapses and then get COVID, they're much more likely to get severe COVID. It's about 5 to 6 times more likely. I'm not saying we shouldn't use them. I'm saying we should just be a little bit more conservative and a bit more reluctant to use them just at a drop of a hat for any minor relapse.
I know for myself, early on in my MS, I can remember not being able to walk in the morning and being able to walk and see same day that I had those high-dose steroids, even though I was told from the very beginning that my disability outcome would be unchanged with or without those steroids. I feel like it is very hard for me and some other patients to reconcile that when you have that feeling of you can't walk and then 12 hours later you are up and feeling so much better, when you may have been incapacitated for weeks or months without them.
And you're absolutely right. There are people who have that response. I think what you're saying to me is that there are people who have bad relapses that respond dramatically, and I agree with you. But that's the message. You have to have a bad disabling attack to get steroids.
We know that stress can lead to relapses, which is stressful to think about. Can you talk about what else might trigger a relapse?
When you actually compare stressful, non-stressful, it only increases your risk slightly. It's not a big risk factor. Outside of stress, the most potent trigger of relapse, believe it or not, is actually withdrawing disease-modifying treatments. Outside of that, the next biggest thing is infections. About a third of relapses are triggered by infections.
Relapses are caused by new lesions or by old lesions reactivating. Relapses range in severity, but no matter how mild it may appear, all relapses should be reported to your MS team. Relapses can be treated with high-dose steroids. However, these are not without risks. Treatment of relapses should be carefully considered. Thanks so much for watching. For more content on MS, from treatments and diagnosis to mobility and sex, check out the rest of MS 101.